Chapter 156. The War. Aura Headquarters. Content warning for sexual content towards the end of the chapter. Monday, 8th of January, 1979. "Please let me come with you," was the last thing Sirius said as Remus left the flat early Monday morning. "I'll be fine." Remus shook his head, trying to give Sirius a reassuring smile. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was, how would that look? It was bad enough he'd been summoned to Moody's actual office at the Ministry. What would he think if Remus brought his boyfriend along for moral support? Still, Remus had to admit he had a difficult time leaving their cosy little home that morning. He barely left the bedroom since they'd returned from the funeral, let alone get dressed or left the flat. To go to the Ministry, he had to wear full robes for the first time since school, which helped a little bit. At least he'd be able to blend in. The visitors' entrance for the Ministry of Magic was about 20 minutes' walk from Soho, and Remus found the early morning stroll more pleasant than he'd expected. It was a crisp, cold January day, and his breath turned white in the winter air. Peter was there to meet him. "Hiya, Moony." Wormtail smiled up at him, giving him an awkward pat on the arm. "How are you holding up?" "Oh, you know," Remus shrugged. Grief was a funny thing. He never knew if he was doing it right. "Looking forward to Saturday?" "Yeah, me too." The full moon was due on the 13th. So far since Hogwarts, the Marauders had got away with apparating, Peter side-alonged, to the most remote places possible and transforming there. So far they'd been to the Brecon Beacons, the Outer Hebrides, Dartmoor, and the Forest of Dean. No one in the Order had brought it up yet, though Remus supposed they all assumed he was registered. Peter and Remus entered the Ministry via a telephone box. Peter needed to be there because after Remus had stated his business, a small silver visitor's badge dropped out of the telephone's change slot. Wormtail picked it up quickly and muttered the incantation to turn it to tin before giving it to Remus. They descended into the Ministry atrium, which was humming with activity. It was an enormous hall, bigger than Gringotts, with rows of fireplaces lining the walls. Green lights flashed intermittently from each hearth as wizards and witches arrived for work. Peter led Remus through the security stand, where his wand was weighed by a mean-spirited wizard with a long beard. Remus was incredibly grateful to have a friend with him, and secretly quite glad it was quiet, genial Peter, rather than Sirius, who had a tendency to get a bit overprotective of Remus when it came to the wizarding community. Next they moved to another hall with a set of lifts, and entered the nearest one. "You're on level 2, Peter explained chirpily. "I'm with the Flu Network Authority on 4. Do you need me to show you where the Aura's office is?" Remus thought he would quite like Peter's help, if only Peter wasn't so clearly enjoying having the upper hand. "No," he smiled. "I'll manage. Cheers, mate." Peter gave him a kind smile as he left the lift. Remus nodded back, and the door slid closed. Soon enough the tannoy announced, "Level 2. Department of Magical Law Enforcement, including the Improper Use of Magic Office, Aura Headquarters, and Wizengamot Administration Services." Remus shuffled his way out of the lift and onto the corridor. The lift doors closed behind him with a ping, and Remus stood there for a few moments, blindsided. It was a very busy hallway, wizards and witches striding up and down, some in deep conversation, others hastily scribbling down notes on scraps of parchment, and some of them muttering to themselves. Over his head, purple paper airplanes zoomed back and forth, fluttering into the office doors which lined the corridor. He wished he hadn't been so proud now and asked Pete to walk him to the right office. There had to be a sign somewhere. "Lupin!" a loud familiar voice boomed. Remus turned round with some relief and smiled, seeing Ferox barreling toward him, hand raised in salutation. "Hi," he said. "Lost? Come with me." Remus followed Ferox along the hallway, past office after office, until they reached an elaborate door with a carved wood frame. Aura Headquarters. "Nervous?" Ferox glanced at him sideways. Remus looked back. "Is it that obvious?" Ferox laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "I'd be concerned if you weren't. Come on now, it's only Moody." And he pushed the door open with one big hand, the other still on Remus's shoulder, as if to stop him running away. As a child, Remus had had some experience with Muggle law enforcement, only ever for silly things like running away from the home or being caught causing a disturbance, which usually meant he was just somewhere public and other people would prefer him not to be. The police were extra rough with you once they clocked you were a St. Edmund's boy. They called you things and shove you in their car, or else give off thinly veiled threats of physical violence if you didn't do as you were told. As a result, Remus had never felt that comfortable round authority figures, even if he was a posh boy nowadays. He wasn't exactly sure how similar the auras were to Muggle police. He'd only met Moody, Frank and Alice so far. Moody was completely terrifying, but Remus had known him long enough now that he was used to him. Alice and Frank were very nice, very earnest people, but then they didn't know what he really was. The inside of the office was very busy, with rows of desks divided up into cubicles. There were posters of criminals, magically enchanted maps and printed lists on notice boards all round the walls, and memos whizzing back and forth. But the most striking thing about it for Remus was the incredible concentrated scent of strong magic, and dark magic too. Ferox's hand, still on Remus's shoulder, steered him toward a desk near the back corner, which had the best vantage point over the rest of the chaotic office. Moody's desk and shelves were cluttered with weird and wonderful magical devices, whirring telescopes, glowing crystals, strange humming orbs. Moody himself was bent over a map. Forgetting his nerves, Remus peered over his shoulder to look. He'd never got over his interest in cartography, and Moody barked, "Never sneak up on an aura, Lupin!" Remus jumped back, alarmed, and Moody turned to face him, grinning. His mad eye swiveled sickly in its socket. "Leo!" Moody reached out and shook hands with Ferox, then Remus. "Glad to see you're nice and punctual. Have a seat." He gestured at a long velvet-covered seat against the wall of his cubicle, which hadn't been there a moment ago. Remus and Ferox sat down as Moody cast a spell which muted the noise around them, creating a bubble of peace around his desk that was not dissimilar to James and Sirius's silencing charms. Remus was relieved by the quiet, but Moody's spell had done nothing to mitigate the overwhelming scent of power which filled his nostrils, swam down his throat, and filled up his chest with glorious, rich, syrupy magic. He tried to relax, to let it find its place in him rather than fighting it, but he was ever so slightly drunk with it all at the same time. "Once again, Lupin," Moody said gruffly, sitting down in his office chair, which looked like a plush green leather armchair, but swiveled on one stem. "I'm sorry to hear about your loss. I didn't know Hope myself, but that's okay," Remus said quickly. "I barely knew her either." He was keen to keep his mother out of any conversation he had today. He hadn't the strength for two things at once, and if Moody had a mission for him, well then that had to be his main concern. Moody, who was either an excellent legilimens or simply astute and empathetic, nodded manfully and continued. "Straight to business then," he said. "Good chap." He swiveled slightly in his chair to pick up the map he'd been looking at and handed it to Remus. Remus took it eagerly and looked. It was a map of Britain and Ireland, but not like the ones he'd seen before. There were no roads marked, nor towns nor cities, only the woodland areas, rendered in mossy green splotches of ink. Some of these splotches seemed to shimmer and twinkle, as if there were stars hiding beneath the tree branches. "Got that from the Control of Magical Creatures office," Moody explained. "Thanks to Ferox here. Know what it is, lad?" "It's..." Remus pored over it. "It's all of the forests with magic in it, or magical creatures." "Exactly," Moody nodded, looking very pleased with him. "We've noticed that most of the werewolf sightings over the past few years have been in enchanted woodland, forests with a denser population of magical creatures. Now, that could just mean they're keeping their ears to the ground for you-know-who, or there are other creatures working with them. Or because the scent of all that natural magic is just too good to resist," Remus thought, his own blood fizzing like champagne just from the 20 or so powerful wizards nearby. He didn't say this, of course, for his own sake. "And for the last couple of full moons there's been a lot of activity here." Moody pointed a stubby, scarred finger at a point on the map, somewhere in the Midlands. "Why are you telling me now?" Remus asked. "If you've been following them for months." "It's time," Moody said, fixing him with a hard stare, one blue eye, one brown. "Greybacks in the country for the first time since the 60s. It's been confirmed." "Oh." Remus pursed his lips to quell the rage inside him, rearing up like a cobra, showing its teeth. "Where is he? Take me to him, right now." "Right. Last time you made contact, you came back with some good information," Moody continued. "Those who want to join Greyback need to transform with the pack 3 times, that's right?" Remus nodded. He wanted to stand up and pace or do something physical, but he couldn't afford for either Ferox or Moody to know that there was anything wrong. "And the next full moon is on Saturday?" Remus nodded. He looked at Ferox, then Moody again. "You want me to go already? To start... to..." "Just for the moons," Ferox said, his voice calming. "Just until they trust you." "But once they trust me," Remus said, looking at his hands, "then I need to meet him, right?" "Let's see how things go," Moody said, choosing his words carefully. "We've 3 months to plan for that." "Okay." Remus didn't know what else to say. His head was full and his nerves were raw, and he felt almost ready to explode, but for some weird reason he just sat there like a polite schoolboy, listening to Moody lay out the plan. He was given a lot of rules. He would have to go alone. He could take his wand, but nothing else. He could tell nobody, not even other members of the Order, not even his best friends. Ferox began suggesting things Remus could say or do to get the pack to trust him, but Remus ignored them. "I'll walk you out, shall I, Lupin?" Ferox said finally, with a note of paternal kindness. "Thank you," Remus said, standing up quickly. "You're a man of few words, Lupin," Moody said, standing up too, holding out his hand once more for Remus to shake. "But I have every faith in you. I'll send you the coordinates before Saturday. Make sure you're at home to receive them." Remus nodded blankly, shaking the proffered hand. Just as he'd guided him in, Ferox led Remus back out of the Aura headquarters. "All right there, fella?" Ferox asked once they were clear of the doors. The corridor was a bit quieter than it had been at 9 o'clock. "Yes, fine. Is there anything you think you need, or if you want me to ask Moody something that'll help, you can just..." "How will it help?" Remus asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the hallway. He twitched his thumb and cast Muffliato without any effort at all. Ferox blinked, surprised. "How will that help?" "How will what help?" "Me meeting Greyback. I've met 3 members of his pack now, and it's only made things worse each time." "That's not true. You've given us some extremely valuable information." "If I have," Remus said, "then I want to know what you're using it for." "To win the war, Remus." Ferox shook his head. "When I met Castor last year," Remus said, his voice very low, but more out of anger than a desire to be discreet, "he told me in no uncertain terms that they were planning an attack. I told Dumbledore, and what happened? Nothing. The attack went ahead. So I'll ask again. If I'm gathering information for the Order, if I'm risking my life to do it, then I want to know what for. It's obviously not to save lives." "Remus, that was an extremely complicated situation." "Explain it." "We couldn't act. We couldn't let the werewolves know you were telling Dumbledore anything. We had to preserve your connection with them." "What?" Remus stared at him. "People died. People had their whole lives ruined. Because of me." "You can't think about it that way." "How would you think about it? I trusted him. I thought I was doing the right thing." "Remus, calm down." Remus realized that he couldn't. He wished he could apparate right then and there, but nothing happened when he tried, so he marched toward the lift instead. "Don't follow me," he growled at Ferox, who held the doors open, stopping him from leaving. "You need to get your head right, kid," Ferox said very seriously. "This is war. It's not noble, and it's not always about saving individual lives. You need to get used to that in time for Saturday." "Don't worry." Remus turned his head, glaring at the panel of buttons. The doors began to slide shut, grinding loudly as Remus tested his magical strength against Ferox's physical muscle. "I'll be ready." The doors shut, Ferox snatching his fingers clear at the very last second, and Remus began to move up, back toward the real world. Remus had barely stepped out of the visitor entrance phone box, and he was standing before his own front door. He stored all that leftover magic like a battery, and he only needed to have the slightest want, and the magic did the rest. He remembered the curse Snape had thrown at James, which he deflected on the last day of school. It would be a useful skill, if only he could depend on it. Not only was he full of magic, but his temper had reached boiling point now that he was home. It was a peculiar feeling, similar to the moments before transforming, right before the mind-numbing pain kicked in. A howling, grasping animal longing. God, he needed... Sirius? He burst through the door, yelling. No luck. The flat was empty. Remus gave a frustrated growl and kicked the wall, knocking a hole through the plasterboard. Fuck, he muttered. Sirius, come here. He pressed his palm against the top of the wall and forced some magic out. The hole at the base of the wall closed at once, thank goodness. It wasn't enough. He had more. He needed to vent it, a release valve. He pulled off his robes, then his jumper, tossing them onto the couch, pacing the room in his thin t-shirt and trousers. He could go for a run. He could apparate to the Lake District for a few hours and just run around like a madman. He could turn the wall to sponge and start punching it until he'd run out of energy. He could drink himself into oblivion, as long as he did something. Moony? The front door opened, and there was Sirius. You're here! Yeah, weirdest thing. Sirius closed the door behind him. He smelled of petrol and motor oil and leather, and Remus felt himself stiffen instantly. Oh, that would work. I was working on the bike up the road, and then... I don't know, I could have sworn I heard your voice. But if you only just got back, then it couldn't have been... Remus couldn't take it any more. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pushed Sirius up against the wall, kissing him hard. Sirius kissed him back, eager to please as always. Remus pressed harder, taking Sirius's lovely white wrists, smeared with oil, holding them, pushing a knee between his legs. He began to kiss down Sirius's neck next, nipping at the soft flesh there, and Sirius gasped. Bloody hell, are you all right? Remus moaned. Just want to... Sirius moved his hips slightly, pressing into Remus's rigid cock. It felt like electricity, and Remus almost lost control altogether, squeezing Sirius's wrists, slamming his eyes shut as he fought to hang on. He wasn't the only one that felt it. Fuck! Sirius panted, helpless in Remus's grip. Was that you? You feel... What's... Magic, Remus managed to stammer, eyes still closed, rolling his forehead against Sirius's shoulder dizzily. There was so much. I just... And suddenly it was Sirius who was in control. He'd turned the tables, and now he was pulling Remus to the bedroom, and thank God the flat was small, and thank God there was no need for any more silencing charms or secrecy, because there was simply not the time. Need you, Sirius was saying incoherently, pulling off his shirt and then tugging at Remus's, black greasy fingerprints getting everywhere. Need to feel you everywhere. Yes, Remus retorted, intoxicated. Yes. Whatever he was feeling, he knew Sirius could feel it too, and he pushed the magic outwards, filling the room with it, igniting every touch. Remus groaned as their bare skin finally met, and Sirius closed his eyes and shuddered, grasping fingers and gritted teeth. Any sense of shame or concern was obliterated by the heat erupting between them. Remus gave in and thought of nothing else as he selfishly arched and bucked against Sirius, who kept feverishly whimpering, "Oh, Moony," over and over. Their fierce rhythm increased as they began to tense and contract, grasping as the world exploded. For a few blissful seconds, everything went white. That wasn't enough. They had to go twice more before Sirius was satisfied, and Remus still felt like he could run a marathon. If you're planning to visit the Aura's office again, Sirius breathed hoarsely, I'm going to need some warning. Sorry, Remus started, but Sirius clapped a hand over his mouth, grinning. Don't you dare apologize. I mean, fucking hell. Remus laughed, pulling his hand away. He waved a hand at the window lazily, and it slid open, letting the cool winter air in. Wow. Sirius raised his eyebrows. How long does that last? It's going away, Remus said, closing his eyes. It was. He could feel his heart slowing down, his muscles relaxing. Last time Snape's curse drained it, so I suppose any kind of counter-magic works. Well, I'd prefer this to cursing you. Sirius rolled over and stroked Remus's bare hip. Remus murmured in agreement, eyes still closed. So, Sirius said, his hand still now, his voice more solemn. It either went really well or really badly at the Ministry. Both. Remus flung his arms over his face. Do we have to talk about it? Yeah, I think we do. Remus sighed heavily. He sat up, searching for his cigarettes. Greyback's back in England, he started. Sirius sat up at once, frowning. He took a cigarette from the box Remus held out, placed it between his lips, lit it, and looked at Remus very seriously. Tell me everything. And Remus did. Chapter 157. The War. The Pack. Saturday, 13th of January 1979. First moon. I hate this, Sirius said, chain-smoking. I know you do, Remus replied. He rubbed his temples. He was getting a headache, not uncommon on a full moon. I mean, I really hate this, Sirius puffed, staring out of the window. He stood there, one arm folded across his narrow waist, other arm crooked at the elbow so that he could hold the cigarette to his lips. He had to keep stretching up on his tiptoes to blow the smoke out of the gap in the window. It was too cold to open it all the way. Every time he reached up, his T-shirt rode up almost to his belly button, displaying soft skin and a line of fine dark hair. Remus lay on the couch, a cold flannel on his forehead, watching Sirius inhale, stretch, puff. Lovely, lovely creature. How had Remus ever got so lucky? It's bloody mental sending you on your own. Why can't I go with you? I could go as Padfoot. No, Remus sighed. You still smell human. They'd tear you apart. What if they tear you apart? Sirius turned sharply. He looked distraught. His cheeks were pink, which was incredible for he of the porcelain complexion. Me? Remus snorted, trying to sound careless. Greyback's prodigal son? Not likely. What's a prodigal son? Oh, right, just means I'm going to get a warm welcome. Gaius said not to hurt me. Livia called me her brother. Could I come with you for a bit, just before anyone else shows up? It's not safe, Padfoot, Remus said gently. Sirius stubbed out his cigarette angrily on the windowsill. Remus wished he'd stopped doing that. They would need to repaint it soon, but now was not the time to scold him. Why don't you go to the Potters? He suggested. Don't spend the night here by yourself. I don't care where I spend the night. Sirius flung himself into the armchair. Well, I do, Remus tutted. I need to know where to go after the moon's down. Shit, yeah. Sirius sat up, sweeping his hair back. Okay, I'll go to the Potters. And if you need any patching up, Euphemia'll be on hand. Fuck, what if you can't apparate? What if you... I'll send a Patronus. But if you're not strong enough... I will be, Remus replied simply. He was going to an enchanted forest based on the coordinates Moody had sent. If there was even half the magic there was in the Forbidden Forest, then Remus foresaw no problem getting himself out, unless someone with equal strength tried to stop him, but he was trying not to think about that. A faint chiming sound echoed through the walls. They hadn't met their neighbours properly, only waved shy hellos in the hall, but they knew they had a grandfather clock because it went off every hour and was so loud they could hear it in their living room. It was 4 o'clock and the depths of winter, which meant sunset was imminent. Remus sat up slowly, tossing aside the flannel. His back ached, early pangs telling him the moon was on its way. I better get going, he said. Sirius stared at him, stricken. Remus tutted, getting up. He bent over and kissed Sirius's forehead. Go to the Potters. I'll be fine. Honestly, you go on missions all the time. Not like this. Defensive stuff, guard duty, carrying messages, not... Someone's got to do it, Remus shrugged. I'd rather it be me. He thought of Danny again and flinched, shaking his head to rid himself of the negative memory. It kept coming up ever since Remus had learned the truth about why Danny had been turned. God, the McKinnons had every reason to hate Remus. He put his shoes on, tying the laces carefully, though he knew he'd only have to take them off again soon. He wore muggle clothes. This had been Ferox's suggestion. The werewolves had no idea where Remus was living, or how he was living. If Remus could convince them he'd been shunned by the wizarding world, then all the better. They hugged at the door, Remus's skin already burning up, Sirius clinging to him so tightly Remus thought he'd have to take him after all. "I love you," Sirius said into his shoulder. They hadn't said it since Hope's funeral, but Remus had no trouble at all responding instantly, "I love you too. I'll be fine. I'll see you soon, I promise." And then he left, and then he apparated, and when Remus opened his eyes he was very much alone. He was somewhere in Derbyshire, at least he thought so. It was rapidly growing dark, and the thick forest canopy made it darker still. The night air was very cold and clean, but Remus was already too warm and began to strip down at once. He was alone after all, there was no need to be shy. Except he was not alone, not completely. This was definitely a magical forest. He could taste it on the breeze, hear it in the rustling of the wintry tree branches. The moon began to rise, and Remus felt his body start to change. He braced himself against an oak, clawing at the bark with his nails, toes curling in the mouldy leaf litter. The trees seemed to empathize. The earth rose up to meet him, damp ground cooling his feverish skin, owls and foxes and bats and all the nocturnal creatures of the woodland crying out as he screamed, and his skin burst open and his bones cracked and his teeth sharpened until he was no longer Remus, and he howled along with them. The wolf snarled, whipping its tail. It did not know where it was or why it was alone. Where were the others? Where was the black one? It sniffed the air, sensing something nearby. It threw back its head and howled once more, singing to the moon. For the first time in its life, the wolf did not sing alone. A cacophony of beautiful voices joined in, answering, and he ran toward them at full pelt. With every beat of its wolfish heart it panted, "Home, home, home. I'm home." Sunday, 14th of January, 1979. Coughing and spluttering, Remus returned to his senses. He came back piece by piece, confused and sore and exhausted. He opened his eyes and squinted at the cold yellow morning sun flashing at him through bare branches. All round him the sounds of others waking up, some broken sobs, rough gasps, and female laughter. Their scent was so delicious, so safe and so comforting. Remus propped himself up on his elbows, dead leaves sticking to his mushroom clammy skin. He had a long claw mark along his right thigh, 3 stripes oozing blood. Around him 6 or 7 others lay naked on the forest floor, slowly coming awake. "Brother!" a familiar cackle sounded out. Remus twisted round to see Livia crawling toward him on all fours, her hips swaying, a deranged grin on her face. In the daylight her tattoos looked like animal markings. They covered every inch of her scrawny body in great sweeping spirals. "I knew you would come." She knelt at his feet, and he tried to draw his knees up away from her, but she shot out a hand and grabbed his ankle. "You were beautiful, Remus Lupin. Beautiful," she purred, leaning forward, her hand moving up his leg. "Get off me, Livia," he growled, trying to kick at her, but she held him fast. "Shh," she said playfully, leaning over even further, her hand moving even closer. "Just relax, my love, my darling brother." She stretched out her hand and ran 3 splayed fingers down the cuts on his leg. It felt weird. His whole body seemed to tingle and quiver. He felt warm and, worryingly, on the verge of arousal. He did pull away then, scuttling backwards on all fours like a crab. Livia laughed at him, holding up her 3 bloody fingertips, then sucking them into her mouth one by one, grinning and murmuring with pleasure. Disturbed, he stood up quickly, finding that whatever Livia had done, it had healed the wound. He was only left with a silvery scar. The others were up too and closing in on him, walking toward Remus through the trees, eyes burning with curiosity, sniffing the air. Some of them were cut or scratched, but they each healed each other just by touching and channeling the natural magic that surrounded them. Many of them had shaved heads and the beginnings of the same tattoos Livia had. Others were perhaps more recent initiates, and had longer hair, clear skin. Remus wanted to summon his clothes, and ideally his wand too, but it seemed a bit rude when everyone else was stark as too. Besides, he wasn't cold. At least not yet. He wasn't frightened either, which seemed strange. He looked round at the other faces. Still that voice deep within him said, "Pack, pack, home." "Gaius!" Livia said suddenly, standing up. Gaius was at her side in an instant. He smiled at Remus, licking his lips. "Welcome, brother." "Welcome, brother!" the others echoed, one after the other, like a peal of bells. Remus felt a surge of adrenaline, of strong, undeniable connection. "We're so glad you could join us," Gaius said. Livia turned to him and began to lick his wounds as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Castor was there too, but he hung back. Since Remus had last met him, Castor had received a wound which slashed over his face, a long split across the nose. It was healed over, but it ruined his once beautiful face. Remus remembered himself and found his voice. "I've had enough," he said, raising his chin. "I've had enough of the humans. I want to see what else there is." Gaius's grin widened and Livia looked up too, blood on her lips and teeth. "Our father will be so pleased," they said in unison. "So pleased," repeated the group. "I want to meet him," Remus said. "Will you tell him that?" "In time, Remus Lupin," Livia and Gaius said. "In time." Something was happening, though. The pack was retreating. They walked away, back into the trees, the brush, fading into the landscape like the predators they were. Remus felt a tug in his chest. He wanted to follow them. He didn't want to lose their company yet. "Where are you going?" he asked Livia as she too began to back away. "We'll see you next month, Remus Lupin," she said, her face softening somewhat. She looked almost kind, if you ignored the blood drying in the corners of her mouth. "It is not long to wait." "But I—" They both turned and did not look back. Now Remus started feeling cold. The chill seemed to begin inside him and work its way out. He felt a horrible empty loneliness that hadn't been there before. Their scent was gone, their familiarity, the safety they represented. "Jesus Christ, Moony," he hissed at himself. "Sort yourself out, you're not really one of them." He summoned his clothes quickly and held his wand tight. It felt weird, somehow vestigial. Much easier to simply summon the strength in his own body, at his very fingertips. No need for a silly stick. He frowned. He did not feel himself. Best to apparate back to the Potters quickly before he turned completely feral. He apparated to the back door and knocked weakly on the glass of the French windows. He felt much more tired by then, perhaps the effort of apparition, or just being away from the forest and back in mundanity. Mrs. Potter was already in the kitchen and came over at once, opening the doors. She beamed at him with creased and wrinkled eyes. "Remus, dear," she said, her voice very quiet. The others must still be sleeping. "I better ask you something. Let me see. Oh, I'm no good at this. Where did you boys go on holiday before your 7th year?" "Cornwall," Remus replied promptly, grateful to be reminded of that wonderful summer. "Near Truro." "Lovely." She opened the door. "Now, are you all right? Anything hurt?" "No, I'm fine," he said, stepping into the kitchen, extending his arms as if to prove his good health to her. Oh God, now he was in the house he could smell Sirius, and everything in him wanted to seek him out at once. "Lovely," Mrs. Potter smiled tiredly. "Well then, I think I'll go back to bed. It's hours until breakfast. The boys are sleeping. Sirius is in his room, but if you wanted a bit of peace and quiet, I've made up the spare bed too." "Thanks, Mrs. Potter," Remus said, practically running up the stairs to the bedroom Sirius was in. He remembered himself just before slamming the door wide open and instead pushed it gently, peering inside. It was quite dark, the heavy curtains drawn over the early sunrise. "Are you awake?" he whispered, redundantly, because he knew that he was. "Moony!" Sirius sat up immediately. Remus hurried over to the bed, hanging back at the last moment because, no, he wasn't a wolf now. He was human and he had to act like it. "Are you okay?" "Yes," he nodded emphatically. "It was fine. It was nothing. We just hunted." "Hunted?" Sirius's eyes widened. "Rabbits," Remus clarified. He could still taste the gamey flesh between his teeth. His stomach flipped and he grew warm once more. "Honestly, it was fine. Easy. I was so worried about you. I didn't even sleep. Do you want to get in?" He pulled back the covers. Remus shifted, still standing. "I'm a bit on edge." Sirius frowned, confused. Remus cleared his throat. "You know, like the other day." "Oh!" Sirius reached out and touched Remus's arm gently. He bit his lip, shivering delightfully, getting a taste of the same feeling. "So you are, He reached out and put his hands on Remus's hips, curling his fingers in under the waistband of his jeans. Sirius tugged him toward him. "That's okay, I can sleep later." They did sleep later, both of them, and thankfully James and Lily and the Potters left them undisturbed. When they woke up at 5 o'clock in the evening, Remus felt like the worst guest in the world, though of course Sirius was perfectly at home. Remus tried to explain the night's events to Sirius, but there were things he couldn't help glossing over. Livia healing him in that intimate way. The desire he'd had to stay, to follow them. It wasn't lying, he was being as honest as he thought was safe. Later he told Moody and Ferox an even more censored version. They didn't ask for much detail, to be fair, and Remus didn't see why he should give them everything. He was keen to keep the other werewolves' identities private for as long as he realistically could, and for now they were only interested in Greyback. As for Remus, he was the closest he'd ever been to the thing he wanted ever since he was a child. He was going to meet the man who destroyed his life, and he was going to kill him. Sunday, 11th of February, 1979. Second moon. In the intervening month, Remus tried to retain a semblance of normalcy. He attended meetings and met his friends. Often he would go and see the girls on their lunch break, Lily and Marlene at St. Mungo's, Mary only a short bus trip away in Kensington. He phoned Grant if Sirius was away and he got lonely, and he listened to records and he read books. But he couldn't ignore how different he felt. Sometimes it caught him off guard. A memory would come to him, or a scent, and his toes curled and he licked his teeth. His dreams became almost exclusively about forests and howling and cool, soft moonlight. He was better prepared the second time. Just as nervous, though. He apparated to the same spot as before in case they came to meet him, but they didn't, and he transformed alone. The wolf found its pack even faster this time. They keened and yapped in greeting. The alpha bitch nipped his ear and rubbed herself against him. The younger wolves ducked their heads in submission. Then the hunt began. The wolf could not remember ever having such uncomplicated joy before, even with its other pack. The rage and the fear and the hunger slipped away with the wind in its fur, the scent of the herd they stalked. When they finally caught up to the deer, Remus, Gaius, Livia, and Castor were the first in. They took down the stag. The others followed suit, closing in on the struggling beast. The wolf leapt and dug in its claws, relishing the panicked heartbeat of its prey. It sank in its teeth and tore away flesh, and hot, rich blood slid down its throat. When Remus woke up, he was not hungry. He allowed Livia to lick his wounds clean this time, too dopey and satisfied to think too hard about any of the implications. "Will I meet Greyback next month?" he asked before Castor and Livia could melt back into the shadows. "Our father is looking forward to meeting you, Remus Lupin," Livia said. "You must be a little more patient, my brother." "Have I proved myself?" "It is not for us to decide." He stayed in the forest longer than usual, perhaps just out of laziness. Even alone he felt better there than he had anywhere else. He would have liked to curl up and sleep beneath the trees. When Remus finally reappeared outside the Potter's back door, it was the middle of breakfast. Lily, James, and Sirius were there, faces anxious and drawn, nursing large cups of milky tea. Mrs. Potter was standing at the window peering out and jumped when Remus arrived. She swung the door open. "There you are!" "Sorry," he murmured, a bit wobbly on his feet. "Oh my God, Moony, are you all right?" Lily was at the door now too, and she pointed at him, horrified. He looked down and saw the blood. It had trickled down his chin and neck, pooling in the hollow above his collarbones, and dried there without him even noticing. "Shit!" He rubbed at his mouth self-consciously. "It's not mine, it's not—" James came to the door next, and Remus suddenly felt very queasy, covered in stag's blood, having feasted on deer only hours before. He stuck an arm out to lean against the wall, giddily. "Come on, Moony." Sirius ducked beneath James and Lily and touched Remus's hand lightly. "Let's get you cleaned up." Gratefully, Remus allowed himself to be led upstairs to the bathroom. Sirius ran a warm bath and then stood leaning against the sink while Remus soaked himself, blinking dazedly at the rust-coloured swirls in the warm water. "It's not human," he said shakily. "I know," Sirius said. "It's deer, I can smell it." "You can?" Remus looked up at him. Sirius wrinkled his nose. "I have to concentrate, but yeah. I was talking to Prongs about it. The longer we're animagi, the more weird things we notice. Hope I don't go colourblind next day." Remus tried to laugh at this attempt to alleviate the tension, but he was too shaken up. "Was it bad?" Sirius asked gently, lowering his voice as if Remus were an invalid. "No," Remus thought to himself. "It was wonderful. I was happy. I was normal." He was disgusted with himself. "What's happening to me?" He looked at Sirius and nodded. "Yeah, it was bad." Tuesday, 13th of March, 1979. Third moon. "I don't want to go back to the Potters this time," Remus said before he had to leave for the third moon with the pack. "What?" Sirius came out of the kitchen where he'd been doing the washing up. He was becoming steadily more house-proud, or maybe it was just the nervous energy. The war was hotting up for everyone, not just Remus. He was wearing a pair of bright yellow marigolds, which Remus had bought him as a joke, but he loved so much he wore every time. They were wet and shining, dripping suds on the carpet. "I said I don't want to go to the Potters," Remus repeated. "In the morning. You can stay there, obviously, but I just won't, okay? I don't know how safe it is. I don't want anyone to follow me." "We've been fine so far." Sirius had been doing that a lot, saying "we" when it was really only about Remus. "I think we've been careless," Remus shrugged. "I don't want to put them in danger again." "Okay," Sirius nodded. He peeled off the gloves slowly. "Where do you want to go then?" "I don't know. I thought maybe Cornwall. The castle ruin we visited. Do you remember?" "Of course I remember. Shall I meet you there?" "Wait for my signal. I want it to be safe." Remus shifted from foot to foot. He wanted to pace. His back was aching again and he needed to go soon, but he kept still in case it worried Sirius. "Moony, if it's not safe, then I'd rather be there so I can help. I know Prongs and Wormtail and Evans will too." "No." Remus raised his voice. "No, please." "But Moony—" "Look, I have to go." He practically flew out of the door. He didn't even put his coat on. He hadn't said a proper goodbye. He hadn't even said "I love you," which they'd been doing every time they were separated, just in case. But of course Remus thought he was coming back. He couldn't have known what the pack had planned. This time it was a relief to shed his human form and give up responsibility for a few hours. They ran and played and fought and howled through the night, rustling fairies up from the underbrush, following scents they picked up. As the moon began to fade, the wolf slowed down, starting to whimper as it felt its body shrinking back to pathetic human form. The others stopped too and drew in close. Livia was the first one to pounce, and Remus, half wolf, half man by this point, tried to struggle, but she held him fast, her paws becoming claw-like hands. Castor and Gaius had him too, pinning him down as Remus groaned and clenched his teeth through the pains of transformation. And then he was human once more, pressed into the ground by the pack, braced against their tangle of strong, hot limbs. He raised his head, yelling, "What are you doing? Let me go!" Livia laughed astride him, throwing her head back, and then it happened. The weird, sucking, squeezing sensation as all four of them apparated, Remus helpless to do anything but cling on and pray he didn't get splinched. Suddenly the ground beneath him was hard, cold stone, rocks digging into his bare back. The others finally got off him and he scrambled to his feet, staring round wildly. They were indoors, in a high-ceilinged chamber, was it a church? It was cold and it reeked of the pack and ancient magic. The others stood round him, smiling madly. "Where the fuck am—" Remus started, but stopped short as Livia stepped to one side and a tall, dark figure approached. Remus knew that scent. He knew those burning yellow eyes. He froze, paralyzed by terror. Greyback stepped toward him, teeth bared in a cruel smile. "Welcome home, cub." Chapter 158. The War. Captive. Wednesday, 14th of March, 1979. "Welcome home, cub." Remus said nothing. For now, he had nothing to say. He just wanted to get a good look. Fenrir Greyback. Remus had expected him to be taller. He wasn't short by any standards, but when Remus stood up straight, they were at eye level. That was good. That gave him a flutter of courage. He may not be taller than Remus, but Greyback was certainly bigger in every other way. Hulking, broad shoulders, thick, squat neck, muscular arms. He had long, thick, yellow fingernails, dark, wiry hair covering his forearms and sprouting up over the collar of his cloak, meeting a dark beard that was more like fur than hair. His eyes were dangerous, inhuman. The magic radiating off of him was not like a wizard's, at least not any that Remus had encountered. Like a full moon, it was searing. The scent, while sickeningly familiar, was not inviting. Remus had felt at home with the pack. He'd felt that he belonged, but not with this man. He was the enemy, and always will be. "Like what you see?" Greyback's smile widened, showing sharp, predatory teeth, long yellow canines. Remus stared impassively back, mouth shut. He realized that Greyback did not like it. Greyback had expected him to speak, to beg or to rage or even panic, and Remus knew exactly what to do with bullies who wanted a reaction. He cocked his head, pulled a nonchalant face, and shrugged. "It's okay, I suppose. Oh, could I get my clothes back?" Greyback's pupils seemed to dilate, or maybe Remus just imagined it. Either way, he recovered quickly, still smiling stiffly. "Where are my manners? Castor!" He snapped his claw-like fingers. Castor appeared at Greyback's side in a moment, straight-backed and wrapped in a fur cloak, carrying a bundle of clothes. Livia was there too, gazing adoringly at her father. The old church they stood in had no ceiling, and in the rosy dawn light Remus could clearly see Castor's face for the first time. There were 3 long pink scars down one side, claw marks, pink and soft as burnt skin. Greyback saw him staring. "Shame about that," he said, reaching out and stroking Castor's cheek with one filthy fingernail. Castor did not flinch. "Hated to ruin something so pleasant to look at, but he's learnt his lesson. Haven't you, cub?" Castor nodded, staring straight ahead like a soldier. "Good boy." Greyback stroked his scarred cheek. "Still beautiful, though, eh, Remus?" Remus said nothing and looked away, disgusted. "And I thought you were a connoisseur of beauty," Greyback tutted with mock disappointment. "That's why I sent you my loveliest children." Livia gave a quiver of pleasure at that, tossing her head proudly. Castor held out Remus's clothes and he took them, dressing carefully. He felt in his jeans pocket for his wand, but it wasn't there. "Ah," Greyback growled. "Looking for this?" He withdrew the long, thin stick from his own mud-spattered robes. Remus felt a horrible twist of longing for it. "I'm afraid we don't allow these foolish human toys," Greyback smirked. He took Remus's wand in both hands and snapped it clean in two. Remus had struggled not to cry out. That had been Lyle's wand. and in fact it had been the only thing Lyle had ever given Remus that wasn't completely worthless. He bit the inside of his cheek, hard. Greyback handed the wand fragments to Livia, who twiddled them gleefully between her fingers like batons. Remus raised his chin defiantly. "What do you want from me?" "I want what I've always wanted, cub." Greyback stepped closer so that Remus could smell his sour breath, their noses only inches apart. "I want to take care of you." He reached out to place a hand on Remus's shoulder, and it took every ounce of Remus's will not to flinch or duck away. Greyback's long fingers squeezed him in a fatherly manner, but a bit too close to his throat for comfort. "I've come to join you," Remus breathed, struggling to hold his nerve. Greyback tilted his head back and laughed. It was a gruff, wheezing laugh from the deep inside his chest. "That's what my children tell me. Remus Lupin has joined us, they say. He has cast off the human world. But I wonder—" He licked his lips, looking Remus up and down lasciviously. "I wonder if Remus Lupin has truly changed his ways." "I'm here, aren't I?" Remus protested. "I've spent 3 moons with—" "And where were you between the moons?" Greyback challenged. He sniffed the air between them. "You reek of humankind." With that, he released Remus's shoulder, pushing him backwards hard. Remus hit the stone floor with a thump and a gasp of surprise and pain as his back jarred. Greyback walked away, his pack dividing to let him through. "Castor, Livia, look after our guest. See if we can't wring some of that humanity out of him." Remus climbed to his feet stiffly and went to chase after Greyback, but Livia and Gaius blocked him with their bodies. Over their shoulders he watched Greyback leave the church through an open archway and disappear into the bright green foliage beyond. Alone and wandless, Remus backed away from the others warily. He wondered if he could apparate, but he didn't dare, and after all, surely this was the mission. He'd achieved what he'd set out to do. He was in Greyback's pack. Pushing any thought of home or his friends aside, Remus faced his captors. Now was the time to be brave. Livia approached him first, tossing his splintered wand parts away and grabbing his arms, twisting them hard behind his back. Castor came next, same stoic expression on his face. He was unwinding a length of rope, holding it out. "Oi!" Remus struggled against Livia. "Piss off, you're not tying me up!" "It's not for long, brother," Livia hissed in his ear. "It is necessary." Then she licked him. She ran her long tongue up from the nape of his neck almost to his hairline. He shuddered in disgust, struggling harder, but she only laughed. She was so strong. They bound him tightly, then forced him forward, Castor leading, tugging on the rope round Remus's arms and body, Livia pushing from behind. He stumbled awkwardly through the church, still unsteady on his feet, having only just transformed. He was shoved towards what once must have been an altar. Behind that was an old arched ambulatory, and beneath those shadows a set of steps leading down into a grave-like cellar. They began to descend, the strong smell of damp earth rising. "Where are we?" Remus asked. "We're home," Castor replied without looking back. Livia gave him a rough jab in the back, and he didn't ask any more questions. They reached the bottom of the stairs, which opened out into a crypt, the vaulted ceiling only just tall enough for Remus to stand straight. There was not much there. A weird, milky light filled the room, but appeared to have no natural source. There were gated chambers either side of the walls, once for tombs, Remus assumed, but now emptied. They'd been replaced by blankets, old stained pillows, and animal furs. Remus blinked hard, his eyes adjusting to the light, and before he could get his bearings was thrown forward into one of the cells. Livia growled some incantation, and the wrought iron bars slammed closed across it, the heavy black chains coiling tight over the lock. "Oi!" Remus threw himself wildly against the bars. "What the fuck?" "Sit!" Livia barked. Remus's legs folded beneath him and he was down. She smiled at him. "Rest, brother. Patience." "I came here to join you. You can't treat me like—" "Do not make me silence you," she hissed. He shut his mouth, voluntarily. Perhaps it would be better to wait and see for now. Livia licked her lips. "Try to rest." She stalked away. Castor was left behind, staring at Remus, face inscrutable, body still rigid. Remus stared back. His poor face. Had that been because of Remus? Had he been punished for the last time in the Forbidden Forest? His dark eyes bored into Remus for a long time, unflinching, until Remus scowled at him. "What?" "Is Remus Lupin truly here to join the pack? To submit himself to our father?" "What do you think?" Remus jutted out his chin, though he knew he hardly looked dignified, sitting on the filthy floor with his hands bound against his body. "I think—" Castor inclined his head slightly, as though no one had ever asked him about his own thoughts before. "I think that Remus Lupin does not yet know what he will do." Remus didn't have a response for that. Obviously, he'd like to think that was not true, that his will was iron, unbreakable. But just now, trapped and unarmed and exhausted, he couldn't muster up much pride. Castor didn't seem to mind. He just nodded very slightly and then backed away into the room. "Rest, Remus Lupin," he said before turning his back. The crypt was filling up now. The other werewolves were arriving, saturating the room with their scent and their energy. Remus backed into a corner, knees up to his chest, and watched them from the shadows. Their ages only varied slightly. Remus didn't think any of them were older than 30. In various states of undress, he could see that all of them were thin and scarred, and some tattooed. None of them were particularly clean. Still, as they all settled in, apparently to sleep off the events of the full moon, Remus couldn't help but feel some sense of security and warmth. He was still getting used to being surrounded by his own kind, and the urge to settle down and make himself comfortable, as they were all doing, was strong. As if their hearts were all beating as one, they were all part of the same body, and now was the time to sleep. Livia was nowhere to be seen, nor Greyback, and Remus took some comfort in this. The dark chamber grew warm, and as the pack settled in quietly, murmuring and whispering amongst themselves as they bedded down, Remus's eyelids grew heavy and his limbs soft, and eventually the exhaustion caught up with him, and he drifted away. "Where are you, you filthy little beast?" Matron's nasally voice screeched as she stalked up and down the echoey hallways, high heels clicking like a predator. "When I get my hands on you, I'm going to wallop you into next week." Remus curled up even tighter in his hiding place, covering his ears with his hands and squeezing his eyes shut. She'd never find him. He was too good at hiding, and very, very small. He was underneath one of the big boys' beds. He knew he wasn't supposed to be in their dorm. He'd get beaten up if one of them found him, but he knew how to keep quiet. He'd learned that in the first few days at St. Edmund's, and now he'd been here for some time, he hardly ever got picked on unless he really got in someone's way. Remus didn't feel very well. He was starting to hurt all over, and his skin was hot and prickly. He wanted his mummy, but he didn't know where she was anymore. Maybe she'd gone somewhere with Daddy and they'd come and get him soon. Maybe they were hunting down the bad man that hurt him. Remus pinched himself hard. He didn't want to think about the scary man. He couldn't remember very much of it except that he was really frightened. Pinching helped, except now the hurting all over was getting worse. The bones in his legs stung and he desperately wanted to stretch them out, but someone might see him. Finally it was too much, and another wave of pain forced him to uncurl, letting out a cry. "Ah! Aha!" Oh no. Matron. Suddenly there was a hand round his ankle and she yanked him hard from under the bed. "There you are, you little monster! Come with me! You know you've got to go to your room." "No!" he moaned as she hoisted him up and carried him under one arm. Not the room. He hated his room. It was so scary. "Let me go!" He beat his fists against her, but she barely reacted, marching down the corridor, down the stairs and toward his cell. "Let me go!" he screamed, crying now, snot and tears running down his face. "I want my mummy! I want my mummy!" "She's not here!" Matron snapped. She opened the door and set him down inside, slamming it shut hard in his face. He heard the bolts go and he began to cry harder. It was so dark. He was scared of the dark ever since the bad man, and Mummy always let him have the hallway light on. But Matron wasn't like Mummy. She never did nice things, only horrible things because he'd been so bad. Was he here because he was bad? Was that why Mummy didn't want him and Daddy went away? He sobbed and screamed, but no one came. It was too scary and too dark, and it hurt. It hurt. It hurt. A horrible growling filled his head, and suddenly Remus remembered why he didn't feel well, and why he needed to be locked up into the room. Remus awoke with a start. His face was wet with tears, and he was sweating all over. It took him long seconds to remember that he was 19, not 6, and not locked in his cell at St. Edmund's. He hadn't thought about the home for a long time, and he tried never to rehash those memories. His heart pounded in his ears, adrenaline coursing through him, and he struggled to get his emotions back under control. He was being watched. It was Jeremy, the young man Gaius had been recruiting back in the Manticore's head. He was leaning against the bars, peering at Remus. "Bad dream?" he asked, his voice rasping as though he was getting over a bad cold. He was thinner than Remus remembered. Remus straightened up quickly, reaching up to wipe his face with the back of his sleeves, finding that the ropes had mysteriously vanished. Had someone come in and untied him? Had Livia done it somehow? The room behind Jeremy was empty now. It was just the two of them. "It's okay," Jeremy said conversationally. "I had bad dreams here too, when I first got here. We all do. They tell us it's all the old stuff coming to the surface, the memories we don't need. Once they're gone, we can start our new lives with the pack." "Were you all locked up like this?" Remus asked, his throat sore. He was thirsty, but he didn't want to look weak. "No," Jeremy shrugged. "Just you. They're worried about you, after what you pulled back in the pub. And there are other stories. They talk about you sometimes." "Who does? Livia? Castor? Greyback?" Jeremy shrugged again, apathetic. "Yeah, that lot. They're in charge. Livia's first because she was turned by Greyback. You get better stuff if you're a direct descendant." Remus snorted. He wondered if Jeremy knew that he'd been turned by Greyback too, and whether or not being tied up and thrown in a cell counted as better stuff. Jeremy began to cough, a deep chesty crackle which racked his body and doubled him over. He pulled his fur cloak tighter around his skinny frame, and Remus finally felt something beyond anger or fear. He felt sympathy. "Do you live here in this place?" he asked softly, looking around at the dank cellar. "Between the moons?" Jeremy nodded. "Better than where I was before," he said. Then, as if bored with the conversation, he simply stepped away. "I'm hungry," he said blandly. "I'll tell someone you're awake. See ya." And Remus was alone again. He climbed to his feet carefully, checking that nothing was broken or sprained or too sore. No, he actually felt better than he usually did after a moon, even with Madame Pomfrey's care. If only he wasn't trapped. If only they hadn't destroyed his wand. He reached into his jeans and found that they'd left him with his pocket watch at least. Remus held the heavy metal object in his hand, letting it grow warm against his skin. He thought about Sirius, though he knew he ought not to. He didn't know who was listening in on his thoughts, and even if no one was, Sirius was a weakness. Was he worried? He must be, Remus told himself. That's what love was, surely. Had he gone to the castle ruin in Cornwall where they'd all agreed to meet? Had he waited and waited, wondering where Remus was? What had become of him? Perhaps he'd raised the alarm, told the Potters first, then got a hold of Moody or even Dumbledore. Remus didn't think either would be much help. As far as they were concerned, Remus would be in one of three situations. 1. Dead. 2. Completing his mission to infiltrate the werewolves. 3. Turn double agent and actually join the werewolves. And from Moody's perspective, whichever it was, Remus was best left where he was. He hoped no one said that to Sirius. Already his resolve was slipping. Remus forced Sirius to the back of his mind. There was nothing he could do but try his hardest to see the mission through, stay alive, and get back to him. That had to be his focus. He paced the cell a few times. It wasn't big, maybe 5 steps across, 3 deep. The animal pelts it had been lined with were deer and bear, and something else Remus didn't recognize. Not wolf. Not anything native to Britain. He touched the bars. They felt weirdly warm and seemed to hum against his skin. Magic. Having a sudden brainwave, Remus stepped back and closed his eyes. He was a bit stiff and still foggy from sleep, but the magic was there, in the room, left over from the pack and from Livia's binding spells. He tried to gather some of it into himself. It was very difficult without a wand, and with his nerves so shaken. He pulled and tugged at the atmosphere around him, but it was like trying to smoke an unlit cigarette. Nothing came through, and he just got out of breath. The magic seemed just beyond his grasp.
"Admirable efforts, dearest."
Remus opened his eyes and jumped, seeing Livia now standing in the middle of the room. She grinned at his discomfort and gestured to Jeremy, who was coming down the steps behind her, holding a large pewter jug and a plate with some food on it. Bread and meat. It smelled like rabbit, and Remus hoped it was. He began to salivate almost at once. Livia snapped her fingers, and the jug and plate left Jeremy's hands and reappeared on the floor of Remus's cell with a pop. So, he thought, you could transport things through the bars. That meant he could get out of them if he tried hard enough.
"Eat up, my darling,"
Livia purred.
"Father wishes us to be strong."
"Thank you," Remus said. He made eye contact with her and tried to hold it. That had worked with Gaius and accidentally with Danny. They submitted to him eventually. Livia returned his stare and smiled, looking very pleased.
"That's my boy."
"Where's Greyback?"
"Show some respect."
Her eyes flashed, and Remus felt a stabbing pain in his skull. He gasped, pressing a flat palm against his forehead.
"He is our father,"
Livia hissed.
"All right,"
he yelped.
"Where is our
father?" It made him sick to say it.
"That is none of your concern."
"I want to speak to him."
"In time, once you've proved yourself."
"How am I supposed to prove anything locked up in here?" Remus raged, frustrated. Livia just smiled back at him.
"Remus Lupin will find a way. Goodbye, brother. Do remember to eat something."
She turned and stalked out, snapping her fingers at Jeremy as she did so. He scurried to follow her back up the stairs, giving one backward glance at Remus as he did, mouthing, "Sorry." Remus watched their feet disappear as they reached the top of the stairs, and then heard a loud grinding noise as something heavy closed over the hatch. The strange light that had illuminated the room all this time went out, like a light switch, and Remus was left alone, locked in the dark. Chapter 159. The War. Submission. Content warning. Lots of nasty stuff in here. Remus is imprisoned and alone. He has some very dark, depressive thoughts. Also some negative body image stuff, bullying, abusive relationships, hallucinations, and paranoia. Sunday, 25th of March, 1979. Remus was going mad. That was the only explanation. Time passed slowly, each second eked out over weeks, and then hours whooshed by all at once like missiles, knocking the breath out of him. They brought him meals, and that was the only way he could measure out his days. No one spoke to him. Perhaps they had been warned not to. Perhaps it was part of his proving himself. They looked, though. They stared. The pack returned every night to sleep. Sometimes Livia, Gaius, and Castor were there. Other times not. Never Greyback, though sometimes Remus thought he could smell him, but that might have been madness. After 2 days in the dark, he didn't trust his senses. After a week, he trusted nothing. He was never quite comfortable, always restless and exhausted, pacing until his feet were bruised. He slept little and often, caught between fitful bursts of unconsciousness and insomnia, and he had terrible dreams. Every bad memory squirmed its way up to the surface of his mind, mostly St. Edmund's, but also that summer after 5th year, when he'd been at his loneliest, and he hated Sirius. He grew paranoid, convinced that it was the others, that they were controlling his mind somehow, forcing him to see things he didn't want to see, things that weren't there. Sometimes he dreamed Sirius was dead. Then, when that had wrung all the terror out of him, he dreamed of each of his friends dying, one by one. Their ghosts visited, weeping or raging. When he woke up, he never felt like they'd quite gone. Other times Remus wondered if he was in fact dead, and this was some extremely specifically designed hell. By the end of the first week he lost all sense of shame. He wept, he howled, he keened, he laughed maniacally or else curled up in the corner and whispered to himself. He tried to have conversations in his head, but it didn't work the same way as before. Grant's calming voice turned into Livia, Sirius into Castor, and Remus was left with no escape at all. In moments of lucidity he tried to summon more magic, but it was very hard, and he was so weak. Sometimes he thought he could do it. One of the others might perform a spell, always wandless, none of them ever did magic the wizard way, to summon something or illuminate the room, and Remus felt that old stirring of power, but it never lasted long enough. Finally, Remus's parents appeared to him, in his head, but also in the cell. Hope was crying. She was sick, even in death, her face gaunt and haggard. She wore a white shroud, and there was earth in her fair hair, even though Remus knew she'd been cremated. Lyle was the worst, though, maybe because Remus had no solid basis for him beyond a few candid photographs. The Lyle his feverish imagination dreamt up was heartlessly cruel, with a plummy upper-class accent and cold blue eyes. "Let that animal destroy my wand, did you?" the spindly ghost whispered in his ear. "I should have put you out of your misery all those years ago." While the other ghosts shamed him, made him feel small and sorry, Lyle had only ever made Remus angry. He raved like a madman at his father and flung himself at the walls of his cage. "Peace, brother." Castor appeared at the bars after Remus had been doing this for some time. "This is not the way." "Fuck off!" Remus snarled, holding his head in his hands as he tried to ground himself in reality. Castor withdrew. Remus continued to suffer. He curled up on the floor and covered his head like a wounded dog. That made him think of Sirius. Stupid thoughts occurred to him like, where was Sirius staying? At the Potters? At their flat? Remus didn't like the idea of Sirius all alone. Was he eating properly? Was he smoking too much? Had he fallen off that stupid bike yet and broken his neck? Was anyone even looking for Remus? He shut his eyes and tried to pretend he was somewhere else. At home in his tiny London flat reading the paper, or in his old bed at Hogwarts with the curtains drawn over. At night in the crypt, Remus could hear the rest of the pack breathing, snoring, rolling over. Some of them cried, maybe when they thought no one else was awake. Most of them coughed, a result of the damp conditions. After a week, Remus caught the cough too, and felt weaker than ever. He'd never been bulky, exactly. He'd always been decidedly skinny, even after 7 years of Hogwarts food. But now Remus barely recognized his own body. The bones in his hip became sharp. His drainpipe jeans slipped down his waist. His ribs stuck up like branches on a winter tree, and his skin grew dry and raw, cracking in places. The physical weakness only compounded Remus's despair. Who did he think he was, joining some stupid rebel army right after school? Had none of the hundreds of books he'd read imbued him with any common sense? Of course he couldn't go up against Greyback. The idea was laughable. So laughable, in fact, that Greyback wasn't even going to kill him. Remus wasn't worth the effort. He was simply going to waste away to nothing in his cell, and no one would ever know. "You're not trying," Castor said, returning to view him. Maybe it had only been a few hours since the first time he'd tried to get through to Remus. Maybe it had been days. It must have been daytime because no one else was in the crypt. "Let me out!" Remus babbled, clutching at the bars of his cage. "Please!" "Let yourself out," Castor replied coldly. "I don't have my wand!" Castor tutted at him. He held out his empty palm and a blood-red flame appeared in it. It lent a soft, alluring glow to Castor's features, blurring the jagged edges of his scar and making him beautiful again. "We don't need wands, Remus. We do not borrow magic like common humans." "I don't have enough," Remus groaned, slumping back. "Idiot," Castor said, closing his hand over the flame, burning it into a fist. "You're brimming with it. You're still thinking like a human. Why do you think he put you in here?" "To watch me die." "Idiot," Castor replied, shaking his head disdainfully. "Why then?" Remus growled. Castor glanced round covertly to confirm they were alone. He came closer. His scent was stronger as he positioned himself right up against the cell bars, and Remus felt an involuntary pull of attraction toward him. Castor lowered his voice. "You're being tested, you fool. You are only the 4th child of Greyback to return to him. Do you know what position that gives you? What kind of power? You've seen Livius and Gaius. You know what you're capable of." "But why—" "You attacked Gaius last summer. Greyback is worried about you now. He won't say it, but he is. No one challenges those two. No one." "I didn't mean to challenge anyone. He attacked me first, and I—" "You acted like a wolf," Castor said triumphantly, his soft lips curling at the corners. "And that is what you must do now." "Why are you telling me this?" Remus eyed him suspiciously, because it made a kind of weird sense now, as if Castor had shaken him awake. "Because you're no good to me in this cage," Castor said, dark eyes burning with intensity. "A year ago Remus Lupin spoke to me of change, of a better life. I have not forgotten." "I seem to remember you laughing in my face," Remus returned bitterly. "The pack was everything. Wasn't that what you said?" "The pack is everything," Castor said fiercely. "That has not changed. Other things have. You are not without allies here." "If you want my help so badly, then you get me out," Remus said. Castor raised an eyebrow, giving Remus a long, hard, appraising look. "It'll be better for you if you do it yourself. The others must see you succeed." Remus was about to ask another question when the atmosphere changed. Livia was coming. Castor backed away quickly and said nothing more. Remus watched him from a distance, his mind finally beginning to work. He needed magic, he needed power, and he needed good, strong emotion to get it all going. Luckily, Remus had always had strong emotions in abundance. That and patience. Buoyed by Castor's intriguing proposition, Remus felt it much easier to concentrate and stay calm. Now that he knew he was not entirely alone, the ghostly apparitions became easier to ignore. And he started to notice things. Like how the other werewolves were not as homogeneous as they first seemed. They were all fairly young. Clearly Greyback had a preferred type. Not one of them seemed older than 25. They were all thin and scarred. But the more Remus watched them, the more he saw their differences. Friendships and alliances, grudges and feuds, likes and dislikes. When he paid very close attention, Remus could tell how long each of them had been werewolves. It was clear from the hierarchy. The younger set fell in 2 camps. Fanatics who worshipped Livia and Gaius, and those who were less sure, less comfortable with this weird subterranean lifestyle. They tended to side with Castor, sleeping on one side of the crypt, talking amongst themselves. Gaius in particular seemed troubled by this group. He stalked the crypt floor every morning, demanding quiet, ordering them to lie further apart. Remus knew from their first meeting in the Manticore's head that Gaius had a short fuse, and as soon as Remus latched onto this idea, he knew he had to come up with a way to exploit it. Help eventually came from an unexpected quarter. Jeremy, one of the very youngest members of the pack, and so far the only one who'd spoken to Remus other than Castor and Livia, got bored easily. He had a mischievous side which reminded Remus of James and Sirius. He often cracked jokes to make the others laugh, and was one of the more vocal complainers when it came to living conditions. Gaius disliked him immensely, of course, and never missed an opportunity to put him in his place. One evening, as everyone was settling down to sleep, Jeremy was struck by a particularly violent coughing fit. In Remus's opinion, he was definitely hamming it up. It went on a lot longer than was probably necessary. "Control yourself, brother," Gaius hissed, on his feet at once, crossing the crypt to stand over Jeremy, teeth bared. "Sorry," Jeremy spluttered, scowling sarcastically. "I can't help it. It's the damp." "Your brothers and sisters seem to manage well enough," Gaius returned, bored. Jeremy snorted. Gaius raised a hand as if about to cast a spell. "Perhaps you need to be reminded how to behave." Jeremy licked his lips nervously and fell quiet. Castor, who'd been sitting nearby, stood up. He placed a hand on Gaius's shoulder. "I will speak to him, brother. Do not concern yourself." "Our father demands obedience," Gaius hissed. Castor's eyes flashed. "I'm well aware of our father's demands." Gaius clearly wanted to retort, but seeing the fire in Castor's expression, thought better of it and withdrew, skulking away, snapping angrily at 3 young women huddled together who'd been watching the whole thing. Castor crouched and whispered to Jeremy, "Do not provoke him." "He's a prick. He's not Greyback. He can't just order us about." "Do not provoke him," Castor repeated, a note of warning in his voice. It was not heeded. "I was coughing. I couldn't help it. Not as if I was whistling a jaunty tune." Giggling from the women nearby. "Peace," Castor said. Everyone seemed to settle down after that. Order and quiet were restored. Remus sat leaning against the back wall of his cell, arms hugging his knees. In one hand he clutched his pocket watch, which had grown hot and slippery from being held all the time. Suddenly there was a long, low whistle. Remus's eyes snapped open, his stomach turning over. That maniac. The girls near Jeremy were giggling again as he began to whistle a little tune. Remus thought it sounded like "Mary Had a Little Lamb," but he wasn't good with nursery rhymes. It only lasted a few bars. Gaius was on him in seconds, snarling, hands round Jeremy's throat. The young man's body went stiff as a board, and Remus could instantly smell the charcoal black magic Gaius was using to subdue him. It was like a faintly tingling sensation. All the hairs on his arms stood up. Remus closed his eyes and inhaled, drinking in the magical energy as though he'd been thirsting for it. The deliciousness was heightened by Gaius's terrible rage, by his flaming desire to hurt. That was it! That was it! Remus was giddy with excitement as the pieces clicked into place.
"Brother!"
Livia's voice now. She slinked across the floor toward Gaius, languid as a cat.
"Leave the pup. He is restless and spirited, that is all."
Gaius released Jeremy, who collapsed back, coughing harder than before. Remus could smell the salt from his tears. Castor knelt beside the young man, a kind hand on his shoulder. Remus began to think quickly. He was rubbish at whistling. He could wolf whistle, and did Sirius love the irony of that, but he couldn't carry a tune. What else could be annoying? He needed Gaius's attention. He needed rage. He cleared his sore throat.
"Still dunno what I was waiting for,"
Remus tried, his voice a bit croaky and reedy from lack of use. There was a splutter of movement, a sense of ears pricking up as if they were waiting to see what he was up to. It was badly out of tune, too, but it was the only song he could remember all the words to. Remus swallowed and raised his voice louder, standing up and approaching the bars.
"And my time was running wild, a million dead-end streets, and—"
A bit more movement now. A few of the younger ones were sitting up, peering over at him.
"Every time I thought I got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet."
A few sniggers. Someone whispered, "He's finally lost it."
"So I turned myself to face me."
Remus shut his eyes and bellowed, rolling his forehead against the cold bars.
"Though I never caught a glimpse of how the others might see the faker."
"Silence!" Gaius's sharp voice rang out.
"I'm much too fast to take that test."
"Silence!" Remus tipped his head back and took a deep breath.
Changes! Turn and face the strange changes!"
"Remus Lupin." Gaius was up, striding toward him, one hand raised. "Stop this at once!"
"Don't want to be a richer man,"
Remus continued, feeling Gaius's fierce magical energy filling the space between them, like a tidal wave of hot air rushing over him, drenching him. He squeezed his pocket watch tighter and drew the magic out of that too, sucking it into his bones, his very marrow. Remus opened his eyes and the bars of his cell vanished with smoke. Grinning, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the crypt. He was free.
"Time may change me,"
he half sang, half laughed at Gaius, who stood before him, gobsmacked. "Get back! Livia! Castor! Help me!"
Shut up, Gaius.
Remus raised his hand, barely thinking about it, just letting the magic do the work. Gaius was silenced. His mouth opened and closed a few times, eyes wide with terror. Remus felt a surge of pleasure at this. Yes, fear me.
Good boy,
he smirked.
Now, in you pop.
He stood aside and pushed Gaius forcefully into the cell, before snapping his fingers so that the bars reappeared at once. Gaius found his voice and roared, furious. "Let me out!" Remus laughed. He was about to turn to address the rest of the pack. They were all murmuring now, various degrees of nervousness and excitement. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Livia appeared on his left, Castor to his right. They were both smiling, pride gleaming in their eyes.
"My brother,"
Livia whispered.
"At last. Father will be so proud."
Chapter 160. The War. Foot Soldiers. References to sex, violence, and animal death in this chapter. The hot swell of power in Remus's body did not dissipate as quickly as it had before, perhaps simply because it was always there, only now he knew how to tune into it. Or maybe it was a defense mechanism, because instinct told him what was coming next. Everyone in the crypt could feel it. A few of them stood up anxiously. Livia closed her eyes and sighed with pleasure. The heavy, swift footsteps echoed through from the church above. Adrenaline flooded Remus's body as the concrete slab covering the entrance of the crypt was pushed aside. Greyback descended. He looked different from before. He was not on the defensive now. He was smiling, his posture and scent welcoming, amiable. Remus's heart skipped a beat. Greyback smiled, his eyes dark and secretive as the forest.
"Remus Lupin,"
he said.
"I think it's time for a chat."
Remus nodded, awestruck. Greyback nodded too, still smiling, then turned and began to climb the stairs again. Remus followed without even glancing back. Finally, this was his chance. To do what? He didn't know yet. All Remus knew in that moment was that his father had come for him, and he was elated. The air grew fresher and cleaner as they surfaced in the ruined church, and Remus breathed in deeply, closing his eyes. It was close to evening, cool and quiet. Under the dimly lit clouds the forest round them was transforming from day to night, the nocturnal creatures yawning and stretching and creeping out of their holes and tunnels. Greyback led Remus up the aisle of the church through the arched exit, and they walked, not very far, through the slender beech saplings, past sturdy English oaks, down a narrow hidden pathway which led to a kind of cave at the base of a hill. A den. Without looking back, Greyback entered, stooping only slightly at the entrance before straightening up as the mouth of the den opened wider and higher than Remus could have anticipated from the outside. He followed because there was nothing else to do. Inside it smelled like home, earth and forest and meat and wolf. Though there was no natural light source, as soon as Greyback entered, a series of torches along the walls of the den lit themselves, creating a cosy, welcoming space. There was even a fire with a pewter cauldron hung over it, brimming with something that smelled thick and savoury. A wooden table beside the fireplace was laden with food of all kinds, freshly killed and skinned game, bowls of nuts and berries, mushrooms, nettles and bread. The sides of the cave had been carved out into shelves and hollows full of books and scrolls. There were a few wooden stools scattered about, and Greyback gestured that Remus be seated. Remus sat, staring about. Further back, hidden in the shadows, he could smell a bed, or at least the place Greyback slept. More distracting, though, was the smell of the stew. Remus had taken most of his meals cold over the past week and half in the dark. The delicious smell of a hot meal threatened to overwhelm him. He watched his captor take a porcelain bowl from a shelf and ladle a small portion of the stew from the cauldron, then pick up a spoon and carry it over to him. Greyback handed him the bowl and Remus took it, still unable to take his eyes off Greyback. His shape filled the entryway, hard, muscular and unmoving. His coarse dark hair was pulled back in a knot, and his yellow eyes bore down on Remus, both curious and challenging at the same time. Despite his larger-than-life demeanour, there was also a quietness about him that Remus had only seen in wild animals, a still silence which promised something more sinister, like a spring-loaded trap. Greyback took a seat opposite Remus, hands on his knees, and nodded at the bowl of stew warming Remus's hands. "Eat," he said. Without hesitation, Remus did not know yet if he was following orders because he had to or because he wanted to. He scooped up some of the stew and put the spoon in his mouth. He could have cried. It was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted, hot and full of flavour, some kind of dark meat and rich onion. He chewed as instructed before swallowing hard. Greyback licked his sharp-pointed teeth. "Good cub." Remus ignored him and continued to eat, suddenly starving hungry. A poem he'd once read popped into his head, like a warning. Though goblins cuffed and caught her, coaxed and fought her, bullied and besought her, scratched her, pinched her black as ink, kicked and knocked her, mauled and mocked her, Lizzie uttered not a word, would not open lip from lip, lest they should cram a mouthful in. Of course that was goblins. You mustn't eat food given to you by fairies or goblins. There was nothing he'd read about werewolves. But then, what had he ever managed to learn about werewolves? Greyback watched him a while longer as they were sitting down to supper together, like old friends. He waited until Remus had almost finished eating to speak. "Picked on Gaius in the end, Interesting, that. I thought perhaps Castor." "He was being cruel," Remus answered. "He's a good cub, beautiful wolf, powerful, but he has a few things to learn about leadership, that I'll grant you. What do you think of my other children, Remus finished eating. He swallowed and sucked on the spoon thoughtfully before setting it back in the empty bowl. He looked Greyback in the eye. "I feel sorry for them." "Sorry?" "For the way they live. There's no dignity in it." Greyback's eyes gleamed. "Dignity. What a delightful creature you are, Remus Lupin. Yes, dignity. That's exactly the word. Exactly." Greyback was stroking his beard thoughtfully. "It is a temporary situation, of course. When the war is won—" "When the war is won," Remus said steadily, "werewolves will be more hated and feared than ever before, because of what you've done, because of your crimes." Greyback tossed his head and laughed, showing long yellow teeth. "Truly delightful, cub. I worried that so long in that cell might have softened you, but—" Greyback raised a bushy eyebrow, and Remus felt an unpleasant wriggling inside his brain, as though someone was swirling their fingers through his thoughts. He screwed up his face, and Greyback gave a low chuckle deep in his throat. "No, still unbroken. My good, strong cub." Remus stared at him. The wiggling sensation stopped. "You mean," he breathed, "you didn't want to break me?" "Of course not," Greyback spat scornfully. "Is that what you think? Are these the vile lies spread about me? Why would a father wish harm upon his children?" Remus cocked his head. "You tell me. Why would you attack a 5-year-old? Why have me locked up?" "Trivia." Greyback waved a long-nailed hand dismissively. "These are not the questions you want answers to. Don't pretend." "How do you know what I want?" Remus felt his temper rising and struggled to keep it under control. He tried to hang on to the feeling of power he'd taken from Gaius, to soak up the magic he could feel in the earthen walls of the den. "I know everything about you, Remus Lupin." He looked at him with razor-sharp eyes once more, and Remus felt that unpleasant shuffling through his thoughts. "No, that's not fair." Remus shook his head, trying to build up a wall against Greyback. "You're using legilimency." "Ugh, a wizard trick. Wolves do not read minds. Wolves see souls." It sounded like the same thing to Remus. Greyback's lips curled into a wicked smile once more. "No, Remus Lupin, it is not the same. One can change one's mind, after all. Remus Lupin might sympathize with his packmates one day and revile them the next. That is the mind. But Remus Lupin's soul—" Greyback closed his eyes and inhaled, as if Remus smelled particularly delicious.
"Stop it! Make me!"
Remus tried. He tried very, very hard, forcing the magic within him back out, through his eyes, through his thoughts. It seemed to work. His mind calmed, and Greyback leaned back, looking pleased. Remus was so confused now. He didn't want to please Greyback. Not ever.
"You are perfectly right to hate me, you know,"
Greyback said, stretching his arms out, rolling his shoulders as though he were preparing for bed or a fight.
"It is natural to resent one's father."
You're not my father, Remus thought in the part of his brain where he still felt like himself. I've never had a father and I've never needed one. Answer my questions, Remus said as forcefully as he could manage.
"If you care so much about me, like a father, then why turn me? Why hunt me down for years, then stick me in a cage the second I show up?"
Greyback was laughing at him again, rows and rows of teeth, long red tongue.
"You can thank Lyle Lupin for your transformation."
Right, Remus pulled a face.
"Awfully human, isn't it? Revenge. Self-preservation,"
Greyback countered, scratching behind his ear amusedly.
"Lyle had ideas about how my family should be treated. Uneducated ideas. He needed to learn. Then why not attack him? Because he was weak,"
Greyback hissed.
"I could smell it on him. No backbone at all. A hypocrite. And I was proved right. A better man would not have abandoned his pup and his bitch, though perhaps I ought to thank him. He destroyed himself before any of that weakness could creep into you."
He licked his lip.
"It's become my motto. Get 'em young, grow 'em strong."
Remus felt like throwing up. He hated Greyback so fiercely it was as if his insides had turned to bile.
"If you believe that,"
he carried on stoically, mouthful of saliva, making his words thick and sloppy,
"then why wait so long to find me? You could have snatched me out of the home any time." "I considered it."
Greyback nodded, tilting his head thoughtfully.
"I took Livia when she was barely speaking, Castor and Gaius when they were tots. But you were a different case. Dumbledore had his paws all over you before Lyle was even in the ground. I knew what that old codger was thinking. His own pet werewolf, his own tamed beast, all trained up and given a head full of wizard tricks and wizard lies. An educated monster."
He licked his lips lasciviously.
"I knew all of this and I thought, why not? Let the cub come to me when the time was right. Let him learn all he can learn of the wizarding world, and we shall see then which side wins out."
"Side? You mean you or Dumbledore?"
"Nature or nurture?"
Greyback sniggered. Remus recoiled, disgusted.
"So I'm an experiment?" "In a manner of speaking."
Remus finally tore his eyes away, unable to stare into Greyback's laser beam gaze any longer. His eyes caught on the bookcase to his right. They were all the classics. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Count of Monte Cristo.
"And the cage?"
he asked shakily, staring at the gold lettering on each of the leather-bound books.
"Was that part of the experiment?" "It was clear that you'd grown too reliant on the tricks Dumbledore taught you,"
Greyback said, as if it were perfectly reasonable.
"You were confined only as long as was necessary to ensure that your true gifts were strong enough to shine through. And they were, cub. Look at you now, just blistering with power."
Remus looked up at him finally, meeting those wolfish yellow eyes once more. Fine then. If he was so powerful he could use it. Burning with bitter, acrid hatred, Remus pushed out once more, focusing as sharply as he could on Greyback's body. Make him weak. Make him hurt. Greyback straightened his back in his stool and closed his eyes, grinning as though Remus were caressing him, not firing every foul thing he could. Then the werewolf raised a hand, and Remus saw that it was trembling, very slightly. Still, Greyback was incredibly powerful, and Remus could feel his own magic countered and blocked. Worth a try.
"Very good, Remus Lupin,"
Greyback said after a time, his voice a little more hoarse than it had been.
Very good, cub, he sighed. Enough for tonight, perhaps. We'll speak again.
Remus stood quickly, feeling as if all this time he'd been weighed down on the stool, and now the weight was gone.
One moment.
Greyback rose as well and pushed past Remus into the shadowy sleeping chamber behind. He returned seconds later with a large grey fur and handed it to Remus.
A gift, cub. Welcome to the pack.
Remus took it and held it over one arm cautiously. It was beautiful, the soft fur silver and black under his fingers. "I can go?" he asked, glancing at the den mouth now unguarded and open. He was suddenly nervous.
Of course. You know the way. You are not in the wizard world now. You are free. Go where you please. Return to the pack. Or else, if you prefer to sleep here...
His face turned hungry again, his smile mocking as he stepped aside and gestured toward his own bed. Remus's stomach turned again, and he backed out of the den as quickly as he could. He stood outside by himself for a long time. Thought of apparating, of getting out of there as fast as he possibly could, going home to Sirius and London and his friends, occurred only fleetingly. Night had fallen in the forest. Remus breathed in the lovely air and looked up at the fine lights in the sky. Owls swooped overhead on the hunt for prey. Foxes crept through the underbrush. Moles ploughed through the soil beneath his feet. He felt as much a part of this place as they were, a natural creature, coming to life. A cool breeze rustled the leaves above him, and he shivered. Without thinking, Remus pulled the fur cloak over his shoulders, wrapping it tight round himself. It felt good, like a second skin. He breathed and exhaled once more, to savour the peace and quiet of being alone. Then he turned away from the den and returned to his pack. Things changed after that, of course. By the time Remus returned to the pack that evening, he already had a new place in the hierarchy. Gaius had been freed from his prison, and he did not meet Remus's eyes, did not challenge him, just slunk away to his corner. Livia made it clear that Remus now outranked Gaius by approaching first and stroking his new furs, purring with joy. "Beautiful," she said. "Beautiful." When it came time to settle in and sleep, Remus had his pick of anywhere he liked on the crypt floor. This had to be a carefully thought-out decision. Sleep beside Livia, the alpha bitch, and what was that saying? It could certainly tell Gaius where he stood. It's what Moody would suggest, if Moody had half a clue how to conduct himself in such a situation. He had reservations about Castor, too. For one thing, instinct told him to side with the handsome young man, and he knew that it wasn't entirely to do with the fact that Castor had helped him. Remus was used to the scent now, but that didn't make him any less attracted. For another thing, Castor was clearly a dissenter. Siding with him might give rise to suspicion from other members of the pack. But he was so tired and sleepy, and he'd already made so many life-altering decisions already. So he chose Castor, who felt safe at least. Remus would have to beg forgiveness later. In the days that followed, Remus got to know the pack not only by scent and as his fellow outcasts, but as individual people. Plenty of them, like Jeremy, were recent converts, teenage runaways, disowned children of shamed wizarding families. All of them had difficult stories of hunger and suffering and terrible abuse. For the first time in his life, Remus felt he had a privileged childhood. So what if Matron was a stone-hearted old cow who hated children? He'd had a roof over his head. Some of them were kind and funny. Some of them were silly and immature. Some of them were sad and shy. Every day Remus grew more desperate to help them, to find a better place and a better life for each and every one. But of course they didn't all have the same story. Some of them were not with Greyback for protection or shelter. Some of them were really there for revenge. They believed in their father's philosophy wholeheartedly. Murder for them was not a crime, only the nature of a predator. The world owed them blood, and they were going to take it. "I believed it too," Castor said the next morning. He'd offered to show Remus their hunting trails in the forest. They caught rabbits and other game using instinct and magic. "I believed everything he said, for a long time. He's the only teacher I ever had." "But you changed your mind?" Remus asked, half hoping, because he still wasn't sure about Castor's motivations. "Yes," Castor replied, not noticing Remus's trepidation. It was a slow process.
What triggered it?
Remus was puffing a bit to keep up with Castor, who was lithe and muscular, the epitome of good health despite his scars. Not one thing in particular, Castor said, stopping still and looking around, as though he caught a scent. He seemed to think better of it and carried on walking, head held high, eyes sharp. He was so natural and relaxed in himself. Remus didn't think he could ever be like that. It vaguely made him think of Sirius, except of course Castor talked a lot less. You had to really drag answers out of him.
Nothing in particular, Remus panted. Something must have...
Books, Castor said, striding ahead on the trail of something.
Books?
Father encourages us to educate ourselves, to develop independent thoughts, and I did. It is the way of nature to rebel against one's father. That sounded eerily like Greyback. Castor often did that. They all did. They spoke with one voice, and it was always his.
But if he encourages that, then why haven't more of the others...
I said that we are encouraged, not forced, Castor said, a small ironic smile playing on his lips.
Oh,
Remus said. He remembered Livia quoting Plato to him. Being educated didn't mean you all came to the same conclusions. I listened to what you said too, Castor said finally. When I was trapped by the Dryad in Scotland, I knew you were my enemy, but I didn't want to harm you. And then I realized I didn't want to harm anybody. I think we can live in peace, away from mankind, as other creatures have learnt to do.
Is that really what you want?
Castor put a hand out quickly and crouched low. There was a rabbit not 5 feet away. Remus held his breath and watched as Castor crept forward slowly, whispering a calming incantation. When he reached the creature, it hopped dozily into his lap. He stroked it softly for a moment, still whispering. Then he broke its neck. Remus wanted to be disgusted, to feel sorry for the rabbit, but he could already smell the blood and his stomach growled. Castor smiled at him, greyish eyes lighting up. He held out the rabbit, blood sliding down his wrist. For you, Remus Lupin. Remus was flattered. Jeremy showed Remus some of the pack's gathering techniques, which basically amounted to theft. There were towns around the outskirts of the forest, and all they needed to do was apparate there and find an empty house, which could be done by scent. They were standing in the bedroom of one such house when Jeremy spilled the whole truth about the pack's part in the war. If Remus hadn't been bothered by a rabbit being unceremoniously slaughtered in front of him, then burgling a house wasn't going to curl his hair. In fact, it brought back a few fond memories of his criminal youth. Still, he really didn't participate, just nosed through the clothes in the wardrobe while Jeremy searched for jewellery in the dresser. The way I see it, Jeremy said cheerfully, Greyback might be a bit full of himself, bit high and mighty, but he's done a lot for me and plenty others. He does more than anyone ever has since I got this bloody bite.
Have you done any self-educating stuff? Remus asked casually.
Not for me, Jeremy said. Never much into reading. Preferred Quidditch. Ugh, pearls, Jeremy tutted, lifting a knot of them out of a green velvet box. Hate the way they feel in your hands. My mother always wore them. Pure blood heirloom.
You're a pure blood?
Remus turned round, mildly surprised. Nah, mother is. Dad's a mix. Doesn't mean much anymore. I'm worse to them than a pure blood now. Bastards. He slammed the drawer shut angrily. That's one of the things Greyback's right about. They deserve what they're getting.
Who does?
The pure bloods.
What do you mean?
Remus knew he sounded stupid, but he was genuinely confused. He'd always been told that some of Voldemort's greatest allies were the pure blood houses, that it was the half-bloods and the Muggleborns who he targeted. He said as much to Jeremy. Oh, yeah, Jeremy nodded blithely. We've done one or two of those, but most of the time we're really a scare tactic to keep the old families in line. Remus pressed for more information, and Jeremy, who'd been eager to do anything he could for Remus ever since the Gaius incident, was all too happy to elaborate. Voldemort was using the werewolves as little more than hired muscle. If any of his influential, wealthy supporters started having their doubts, then all it took was a visit from Fenrir Greyback and a few of his mad, feral acolytes to get anyone back on the same page. Seen loads of mansions lately, Jeremy cackled with laughter. He caught the look Remus was giving him. Oh, what? I told you, they deserve it. They shouldn't have gone over to his side in the first place.
So, wait, you don't even support Voldemort?
Remus gaped at him. Course not. He's a right weirdo. Scares the shit out of me, to be honest, but I didn't choose this side, it's just a hand I got dealt.
But if you did have a choice,
There is no choice, Remus Lupin, Jeremy said fiercely, that voice coming out of his mouth which wasn't his own. There is the pack. We can trust no one else. You must get used to it if you want to be one of us. And that was as far as he could get with any of them. After a certain point, they all reverted back to the same old script. Greyback was their leader, and even if they did not agree with him in everything, most of them felt indebted to him and trusted him before anything else. By daylight, Remus was never sure if he could really trust Castor or Jeremy, or the others. Even Castor, who was interested in hearing what Remus had to say, and who was determined to convince the others to withdraw from the war. It's not an easy thing, Castor tried to explain, to realise that our father is wrong, that we must have no part in any wizard affairs, least of all the war. It would mean splitting the pack.
Can you do that?
Remus asked, impressed. Castor gave a small shrug of his shoulders.
Perhaps.
Remus expected to see Greyback again, now he had been fully initiated, but the pack father stayed strangely remote. He occasionally summoned Livia, who Remus learnt had been with him the longest, almost all of her 30 years. Remus was shocked to learn her age. She seemed at once too young and too old. Otherwise Remus was left to his own devices. He could have left whenever he liked. That had been made clear to him. But he told the others in the pack that he had nowhere else to go, like them. He needed their trust, and for that they needed to be able to relate to him. So he never tried to sneak away and send a message to the Order. He wasn't even sure if that was possible, but he didn't try. He knew he might never have this chance again. After all, it was what Dumbledore had bred him for. As far as Dumbledore and Moody and Ferox and every other adult who liked pushing Remus round their chessboard was concerned, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And he wasn't miserable. He was lonely, of course. He longed for Sirius like a missing limb, and he'd have done anything for a shower, a cigarette, and a bar of chocolate.
But the forest had begun to feel like a place he belonged. The other wolves felt like family. His mission grew clearer every day, and he knew he couldn't leave. So he stayed in plain sight at all times, and didn't speak a word about his friendships and connections back home. Friendship was different amongst the werewolves. Pack solidarity was everything, and Remus felt it too. Sometimes he thought he would die to protect them, even Gaius. The only feeling that had ever come close to it was when the Marauders were in their animagus forms back at Hogwarts, and Remus supposed that made some sense. Sex was different with them too. Midway through the month, Remus noticed a few pack members pairing off, vanishing into the woods for an hour or so, returning with that all too familiar scent. It was obvious what they were all doing, but no one seemed to mind or take much notice. It was just another instinct they all accepted and followed without question. The desire grows stronger as the moon approaches, Castor explained as they lay in the crypt one night trying to ignore the quiet gasping and fumbling around them.
I'd never noticed before,
Remus lied, staring up at the ceiling.
If you choose to mate, Casper whispered, choose wisely. They look up to you. They will notice favoritism. No, Remus said. I'm not. I have someone already. A human? Yes. Then you plan to return?
Castor finished. He sounded so sad about it. Remus wanted to turn and apologize, comfort him somehow, but that was dangerous territory and he knew it. The air was already thick with lust, and he didn't know what he'd do.
I have to, eventually, Remus said, but I want to make sure you're all safe first.
We will survive without you, Remus Lupin, Castor returned, his voice no longer its usual calm, steady timbre. You are not our leader, yet.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can head over to our Patreon or check out some of the official Bibliobabuli merch. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and until the next video, happy reading.